Imagine being on an isolated farm surrounded by vast silent fields. During the day, everything seems calm, but when night falls, that silence turns into something terrifying. Unexplained sounds, shadows that seem to move on their own, and that constant feeling that you're not alone. In today's video, we'll explore a chilling story that took place on one of these farms, a tale full of mysteries and dark events that defy any logical explanation. Leave a like to support the channel and pay close attention to every detail, because in this story, nothing is what it seems. Now tell me, would you feel safe sleeping in a place like this?
The farms, with their vastness and solitude, have always been the ideal stage for horror story. They are not just cultivated fields or barns stuffed with hay. They are places where silence carries dark secrets, and the wind whispers tales that no one else would dare to tell. There, far from the frantic pace of the cities, time seems to drag in a peculiar way, as if the place is in constant wait for something that never reveals itself, yet everyone knows it's about to happen. At night, when darkness takes over everything, one can hear sounds that shouldn't exist. The creak of a door no one has touched, the rustling of dry leaves moved by invisible hands, the distant scream of an animal, or the echo of hurried footsteps that disappear without leaving a trace. The shadows cast by the dim lights of the lamps seem to come to life, twisting in a sinister way, as if they are watching, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal. In every corner of the farm, in every forgotten ruin, there are traces of an untold story. Perhaps it was there that some ancient resident, in despair, disappeared without a trace. Or maybe a family secret was buried deep in the barn, waiting for the day when the earth would open up to bring it to light. It is this atmosphere of mystery and isolation that makes farms the perfect setting for the supernatural. Because among the shadows and silence, it's possible to perceive that these places hold more than the story of the man who inhabited them. They are witnesses to something ancient, something that transcends time and still echoes in the wind, waiting to be discovered. On moonlit nights, when the wind seems to murmur through the trees, the ancient farms appear to come to life. The pale light of the moon, filtered through the treetops, creates a play of shadows that stretch and twist, taking on unknown shapes, as if the very ground hides something ancient, something that rests in the depths of time, waiting to awaken. The wind, with its soft lament, seems to carry voices from the past, distant whispers speaking of mysteries buried beneath the soil that stretches out before us. As the night progresses, the scene transforms. What once seemed like a simple rural landscape, with its fields and barns, now reveals itself as a place laden with enigmas. The sound of the wind in the leaves is like a warning, a reminder that the land that has welcomed so many generations holds, in its heart, secrets that have never been fully uncovered. Could the soil with its deep roots be the guardian of something older and more terrifying than the very history of the men who tilled it? The shadows that stretch out seem to have a will of their own, as if they are watching, waiting, ready to move. Perhaps they are the manifestations of an ancient presence, a primal being that has inhabited the land since time immemorial, older than any human memory. What could have happened on that farm so many years ago that still echoes in the silent nights? What rituals and mysteries were buried with those who came before, and whose names were erased by the breeze that now whispers across the fields? What could be older and more terrifying than the land that has welcomed so many generations? Perhaps, deep down, it itself is the oldest of all witnesses, a living memory of what happened beneath its soil, something that remains hidden, waiting for the eye. Moment when the full moon can illuminate the secrets that still lie there. It was in one of these farms, isolated in some remote corner, that a sinister story unfolded. The family who lived there, many years ago, never spoke of the events that forced them to abandon the house. The few residents of the region, who avoided passing near that place, whispered among themselves, fearful that their words might invoke something that should not be. They said the farm was cursed, that something dark and ancient rested beneath its soil, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. What happened in that house, no one knew for sure, but everyone spoke of the last night the residents were seen. The moon was strangely low, casting a cold and opaque light over the fields. The wind, like an uneasy spirit, carried indecipherable sounds, and the trees seemed to bend in an unnatural way, as if they wanted to push away what was about to happen. When the last carriage left, no one ever looked back. The family's relatives, who were few and distant, could never explain what caused them to abandon everything so abruptly and silently. The few who dared to approach the house afterward never managed to stay more than one night. There was something in the air, something that weighed on the hearts, something invisible and ancient that seemed to watch every step. The roofs collapsing and the cracked walls were not the greatest signs that something was wrong. What truly terrified was the distant murmur that, at night, echoed through the walls, as if the very house were breathing, exhaling the fear accumulated over the years. The bravest ones claimed that upon entering, they could feel an intense cold, a chilling touch that did not come from the air but seemed to emanate from the depths of the earth. And those who dared to explore the old barns or attics said they found signs of an unknown cult, strange symbols and markings carved into the walls, as if someone had tried to seal something that could never be set free. And so, the farm remained, a relic of the past, shrouded in mystery. Those who dared to enter it would never leave without leaving a mark on their soul. Something of that house stayed with every visitor, an unwanted memory, a presence that clung to the spirit and never let go. They said it was as if the earth itself had swallowed the family's secrets and kept them trapped there, waiting for the next to dare uncover what truly happened. And perhaps, one day, those who looked at the farm from afar would feel the shadow of what happened in their own soul. It was in one of these farms, isolated in some remote corner, that a sinister story unfolded. The house, hidden by the mists of time and the dense vegetation surrounding it, seemed like a relic from another world, preserved by a veil of mystery and fear. The family that lived there, many years ago, never spoke of the events that forced them to abandon the house. Their eyes, always dark, avoided any mention of the past, and their mouths would seal when the name of the farm was spoken. The silence that enveloped them was heavier than any word, denser than the air itself. The few residents of the region, who had already heard rumors and stories told by the fire, whispered among themselves, always casting furtive glances to the corners, as if they feared the very farm was listening. They said the house was cursed, that something very old and terrible was trapped beneath its foundation. No one knew exactly what happened, but everyone agreed that an evil had settled there, something that could not be explained, but which could be felt, like a constant presence, as if the winds blowing through the trees carried echoes of suffering and pain. Anyone who dared to cross the gates of the farm, even if only to satisfy curiosity or challenge the rumors, would never leave unscathed. There was something strange about the atmosphere of the place, the heavy air, the muffled sound of footsteps, the feeling of being watched. And it wasn't just those who entered who felt this. Even those who looked from afar, from a safe point, could sense that something was wrong. The shadows in the window never seemed to be in the right place, and the wind, always hissing, seemed to whisper secrets in a forgotten land. The few who, by accident or curiosity, dared to spend the night inside the farm returned changed, with empty eyes, as if they had seen something they could neither understand nor forget. Some claimed to have heard voices, others said they felt a cold presence touching their skin. But the most common report was an indescribable feeling of dread, as if the house were alive, feeding on their fears, suppressing their wills, shaping their thoughts. The elders spoke in whispers that the curse of the farm was not limited to the place itself. It was rooted in the very land, in what had been buried there at some point in the past, and that no one would dare name. Something terrible and immortal, perhaps the remnants of a mistake made by those who once lived there, something that had perpetuated itself over the years, patiently waiting for new visitors. Anyone who dared enter the farm would never leave without marking their soul. It didn't matter how much they tried to escape the place, nor how long they tried to convince themselves that what they experienced was nothing more than a hallucination. The truth was that the house left a deep and invisible trace, something that clung to the spirit, becoming a part of those who visited. And even if someone managed to physically distance themselves, the mark of the place, the cold touch of its presence, would never abandon them. It all began with the sound. At first it was just distant echoes, as if the wind were playing with the branches of the trees, creating a soft melody that got lost in the vastness of. At first, no one paid attention. It was something common in isolated places, where the wind carries sounds and distorts them in unusual ways. But as time passed, the sound grew louder. First, a faint murmur that seemed to crawl through the night, then a rising wave, as if something or someone was trying to communicate with the world. It was then that, one night, the sound became clear, unmistakable. It was a scream, something deeply human, but still impossible to identify. It wasn't a scream of pain, nor of desperation, but something more primal, more ancient, an expression of something that should not be heard. It stretched through the air, infiltrating the minds of those who listened, provoking a sense of unease that couldn't be ignored. No one knew where it came from. Some said it was just the echo of the trees. Others, more superstitious, spoke of lost spirits, of condemned souls wandering the land. But no one dared to investigate. As the sound repeated, night after night, it became more enigmatic and disturbing. It didn't seem to come from a single point, but from several places around the farm, as if something moved between the shadows, lurking. Some residents, disturbed by the presence of the sound, tried to sleep with the windows shut, but it was no use. The screams seemed to enter their homes, silenced only momentarily by sleep. When they woke up, the feeling of unease remained, as if the sound were still echoing in their bones, immersed in their memory. Over time, the farm was avoided. Those who still lived nearby never passed by at night, and the elders, who remembered the days of prosperity of the house, told stories about the scream, suggesting that it was connected to something that had happened there long before, something that should have been forgotten, but for some reason, could not be silent. What lay behind that sound, no one knew. But with each passing night, it grew stronger, more desperate, and everyone who heard it felt, in some way, that something was about to happen. On a cold, dark night, when the moon could barely hide behind thick, heavy clouds, a group of young people decided to investigate. Curiosity outweighed fear, and the desire to uncover the mystery that hung over the old farm pulled them in, almost like an invisible magnet. They had grown up hearing rumors, whispered stories, and hushed conversations about screams in the middle of the night and a strange presence that hid among the shadows of the property. But nothing could stop the impulse to challenge to go there and see for themselves what, after all, was hidden behind all those legends. They knew the farm had been abandoned. The rusty doors, the broken windows, and the field around it, covered in impenetrable vegetation, gave the house an even darker appearance. No one, not even the closest neighbors, dared to approach after dark. But, like in every place where fear resides, the mystery called, and the force of curiosity seemed stronger than any warning. As they approached the farm, the sound of their footsteps was muffled by the mud and the dry leaves scattered along the path. The wind, cold and cutting, hissed through the trees, as if trying to drive the intruders away. But the young people did not hesitate, for something greater seemed to draw them in. They didn't know exactly what was driving them, but a strange feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for them inside made the experience even more terrifying. When they entered the farm's grounds, a peculiar shadow enveloped them. The air was heavy, thick, and the silence oppressive. There were no more nervous laughs or casual conversations. Now, every step was taken with caution. The distant sound of the wind in the trees seemed to blend with a faint murmur, as if the house itself was communicating. And when they finally reached the door of the house, it opened on its own, with a loud, threatening creak, as if inviting them in. Fear no longer mattered. What held them now was the need to understand what had happened there, what the former residents had left behind, what made the farm be avoided by everyone. They were there, not only to satisfy their curiosity, but to unravel the secret, no matter how terrible it might be. When they crossed the threshold of the door, the air seemed to change. Something, or someone, seemed to be watching them. And then, in the dark depths of the house, a sound was heard, low, almost imperceptible, but with the intensity of something that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. The young people, now paralyzed, felt as though the entire farm was waking up around them, as if, finally, what had been hidden for so long was about to be revealed. The noise became clearer as they approached, a presence that infiltrated the silence of the night. The wind, which had once only whispered through the trees, now seemed to carry something, a lament, a sound that made them question whether it was truly the wind or something deeper, darker. The distant crying, almost inaudible, dragged through the air like a lost sigh, coming from within the very farm, as if the walls of the house were filled with ancient. It was as if the house was breathing, with its old and creaking sighs, like a living being waiting for the intruders with a macabre patience. Each step they took echoed on the dirt floor, amplifying the fear that settled in their minds. The shadows around them seemed to stretch, as if wanting to reach the young people, envelop them and swallow them, taking them into the unknown. The surrounding field, vast and dark, seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the earth itself wanted to absorb those who dared to enter its forbidden territory. The young people's eyes, accustomed to the dark, tried to catch any movement ahead, but the fog rising from the ground prevented them from seeing clearly. The wind, which had once been just a breeze, now became biting, carrying a strange weight, as if it wanted to push them away, warning them of the imminent danger. The sound of the crying, which seemed to come from all corners, enveloped them, making the environment even more claustrophobic. It was no longer just the fear of the unknown, but a palpable sense that they were being watched, that something, or someone, was watching them from afar. The house, now before them, seemed to have come to life. The broken windows, like empty eyes, stared at them with a coldness that cut to the soul. The door, slightly ajar, creaked softly, as if it was waiting for them, inviting them in. The field, dark and vast, seemed to swallow them with every step, making escape impossible, as if the very place were a labyrinth that trapped them. And as they advanced, the crying grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from within their own minds, whispering secrets that no one should hear. There, in the heart of that forgotten farm, fear was not just an emotion, it was a presence, a living force that fed on their curiosity and that, little by little, began to reveal the true face of the place. Inside the house, the air was dense and oppressive, as if the walls knew something the visitors could not yet comprehend. The doors creaked with a low and melancholic sound, as if being opened by invisible hands, those that had long been forgotten but still active, waiting for the new intruders. The atmosphere, saturated with the smell of rotting wood and mildew, seemed to swallow any hope of, as if the house itself were exhaling the weight of the years, keeping its secrets in the shadows that danced on the walls. The weak light that filtered through the broken windows seemed insufficient to chase away the darkness that lingered, but in the midst of the macabre silence, there was something else, something that stood out in the scene. An old clock, stopped in time. Its face was blurred, covered in dust, but it was still possible to see that the hands pointed to an impossible hour, an hour that should not exist. The ticking, faint and irregular, was the only sound that could be heard in the house. A sound that, though muffled, echoed in the hearts of those present, like an insistent whisper, a reminder of what had once been, of what was still trapped there, held between the seconds and the years that had passed. The clock seemed to defy time itself, stopping at the exact moment the farm was marked by something dark, by an event that froze the house in the eternity of a lost instant. Each tick-tock was like an echo of the past, reminding everyone that time there did not flow as it should. It was broken, interrupted, just like the fates of those who dared to live in place. As the sound continued, unchanged, the shadows around seemed to move subtly, as if they were stirring to the rhythm of the ticking, feeding on, absorbing it. Something in that house did not want to be forgotten, did not want to be left behind. Time had stopped, but memory, it did not. It kept pulsing, repeating itself endlessly, as if waiting for the right moment to reveal itself, to escape the invisible chains that bound it. And perhaps the clock was the key to everything. Perhaps it was it, stopped and trapped in that moment, the witness to something much deeper and more terrifying. As they entered the barn, the air grew denser, as if an invisible pressure was building on their shoulders. The wood of the walls creaked with every step they took, echoing through the vastness of the space, but the sound seemed to get lost in the immensity of the place, swallowed by the darkness. The lantern's light flickered, casting grotesque shadows that danced on the walls, as if the lamp itself were afraid of what was hidden there. The warmth of the flames seemed to dissipate quickly, as if something were draining the energy around it, making the atmosphere colder with every passing second. They moved forward cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the straw scattered on the ground. But as they neared a darker corner, the silence that enveloped them became deafening, and it was then that they saw something that made them freeze. A pair of eyes glowing in the darkness, reflecting the lantern's light with an almost supernatural intensity. They were large, bulging eyes, with a glow that seemed to emanate from the depths of an abyss, impenetrable and piercing. Watching them with no sign of movement, fear froze their veins. The lantern, now trembling in one of the young people's hands, seemed to hesitate, as if it too sensed the danger. Unwilling to fully illuminate the darkness, time seemed to stand still. None of the young ones dared to breathe, as if any movement might attract the attention of whatever was watching them. Those eyes floating in the dark seemed almost human, but something in the depth of their glow made them feel that they were not. They were not from any creature they knew. What could it be? Someone was watching them, but who? Or what? Their minds raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but none made sense. There was nothing there, or at least nothing they could see. The darkness seemed to swallow everything, except those eyes, as if an invisible presence were surrounding them, making no sound, leaving no trace. Whatever was there, it was waiting, patiently, like a predator waiting for the right moment to move. Each of their hearts was racing, but somehow, none of them. Fear paralyzed, but curiosity drove them to look once more. That's when the glow of the eyes seemed to intensify, and the darkness around them deepened even further. Something was about to happen. Something that, perhaps, had already happened before and was about to repeat itself. Terror took hold of them, a shiver running down each of their spines. But curiosity still drove them forward, like an invisible thread pulling them toward the unknown. Fear blended with excitement, making each step an internal struggle between fleeing or moving ahead. However, with every movement they made, the weight of their legs grew heavier. The ground, which had once seemed solid and safe, now appeared to deform beneath their, as if it were absorbing their energy, making every step harder to take. It was as if the very terrain itself were resisting their presence, turning progress into an almost impossible task. The air was thick, filled with a premonition that enveloped them, making everything around them even more oppressive. Every breath was difficult, as if the house itself was sucking their breath away, as if the space were closing in on them, growing tighter with each passing moment. The lantern's light, once steady, now flickered, weak and ready to go out at any moment, and with it, the fear grew, an increasing sense that something was drawing near, that they were not alone in that place. The shadows, those seemed to stretch, elongate, and move as if they had a life of their own. They spread across the walls and floor, wrapping around them, trying to reach them. It was as if the very environment was transforming, adjusting to their presence, preparing to swallow them whole. The outlines of the shadows seemed to grow, like long, cold fingers, touching them without them being able to see them, but feeling them in every nerve, in every pulse of their veins. With each step, the air grew thicker, denser, as if the very space was closing around them. Whatever was there, in the depths of the house, seemed to be waiting for them. Increasingly, the feeling of being watched intensified, as if the house itself were alive, breathing with, absorbing their fears, feeding off the growing tension. Even though the terror was becoming almost unbearable, something inside them pushed them forward, to keep going, to discover what truly hid in the darkness. But the feeling of being consumed, of the place taking their strength, never faded. They were about to uncover something they shouldn't, and with every step, it seemed like it was too late to turn back. The ground, the shadows, and the dense air surrounded them, as if pulling them toward a fate from which they could not escape. The barn door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash, the sound reverberating off the walls of the echo of the impact still lingered in the heavy air. Suddenly, the wind, which had once seemed to play with the branches of the trees outside, now transformed into a frantic scream. It howled against the barn walls, as if it wanted to break through the wood and swallow the intruders. The sound was torturous, relentless, and seemed to make the air even thicker, denser, making it harder to breathe. The windows, long covered by a dark veil of dust and cobwebs, seemed to hide more than just the darkness. The veil of dirt and neglect gave the impression that time in this place had stopped long ago, and with it, any possibility of escape. No light filtered through the cracks anymore. Everything was sealed, immersed in an oppressive twilight that seemed to grow darker by the second. The group of young people stood still, terror rising in their chests as the truth sank in. There was no way out. The door had closed with a snap that felt final, and the wind, now transformed into a destructive force, seemed to whistle some kind of warning. Whatever had drawn them to this place was now trapping them. The feeling of being trapped, surrounded by an invisible and relentless force, intensified, and their gazes met in a frozen silence, unsure of what to do next. The barn, once just an abandoned, forgotten space, now seemed to have turned into a trap, a labyrinth of shadows and echo, where each step felt harder than the last. The walls, now closer, breathed with, as if the place itself were alive, feeding on the growing fear that surrounded them. The sensation of claustrophobia mounted, the tension becoming almost unbearable, as if the walls were slowly closing in, an invisible prison with no room for escape. And at that moment, with the door locked and the wind howling outside, it became clear, something far more sinister was waiting for them inside. The presence that had drawn them in now kept them here, watching, waiting, as if preparing to reveal its true purpose. The silence, which had until then seemed oppressive, was broken by an unexpected sound. They heard something dragging upstairs, a low and drawn-out noise, as if a heavy body were being moved slowly across the wall. The sound was irregular, interrupted by unsettling pauses, as if the thing or creature that was making the noise moved cautiously, waiting to be discovered. The creak of the boards under the weight was a mixture of pain and patience, a sound that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. The fear intensified, slowly crushing them, like an invisible pressure taking hold of their hearts. Their eyes met, searching for answers in each other's faces, but no one had words to explain what was happening. Each of their bodies trembled slightly, but something stronger than fear, kept them steady. It was the need to know, to understand what was trapping them. They couldn't just run away, not without understanding what was upstairs, what was dragging itself in the shadows. The strength of their will kept them grounded, preventing them from turning their backs and running for the door. They had to know what it was. If there was something or someone there, some presence watching them, they wanted to face it, not flee. The instinct for survival was mixed with curiosity, with the desire to finally reveal the mystery, to expose the truth that hid in the depths of that cursed house. The sound, now louder, dragged itself slowly across the upper floor, closer, clearer. It seemed to be heading toward the stairs, as if something was coming closer to them, drawn by the presence of the young people, as if it were waiting for them. The atmosphere grew denser, heavier. Each breath became more difficult, but the determination not to succumb to panic pushed them forward, into the unknown, toward whatever was waiting upstairs. The lantern trembled in one of their hands, but they couldn't let that stop them. The door to the upper floor was there, in front of them, like a portal to something much older and darker. They knew that if they wanted to leave that place alive, they had to face whatever was waiting in the dark. And, with a collective sigh, they climbed the stairs, their footsteps echoing through the barn, until the sound upstairs fell silent, waiting for the moment to reveal itself. The lantern's light flickered, wavering, as if the flame itself feared what was about to be. The sound of their hearts beating fast was the only noise in the heavy air, and the young people's breathing was interrupted by the absolute silence around them. And then, when the lantern's light returned, what they saw froze the air in their lungs. In the shadows, something moved. It was something non-human. The figure seemed to emerge from the darkness, as if it were made of shadows itself. It was tall, much taller than any of them, and its presence was so dense it seemed to distort the space around it. What should have been a human body became indistinguishable in the shadows, a mass of darkness stretching and writhing, fluid, as if it had no defined boundary. Its eyes, completely black, seemed to swallow all the light from the lantern, reflecting a deep emptiness, an endless darkness. There was no gleam, no life there. They were pits of abyss, inhuman and devoid of any soul, as if the very essence of that thing had been erased, leaving only a shell of pure darkness. Where a face should have been, there was only a smooth surface, without any trace of humanity, an empty mask of feelings or intentions. The presence emanated a cold energy, a force that seemed to suck them in, making them want to curl up and disappear. It was as if the very earth, the ground beneath their feet, were giving birth to this entity, as if it had emerged from the deepest abyss of nature, from something that had been there before humans, before history itself. It seemed to have no purpose, no form, no explanation. It existed only as a reflection of darkness, of what hides in the crevices of the world, waiting for the right moment to manifest. And in that moment, they knew, whatever it was, they didn't belong to that place. It wasn't a human creation. It wasn't a legend or a myth. It was something much older, much more terrifying, something that couldn't be rationalized. They were face to face with the impossible, with the unknown, and the fear now wasn't just emotional. It was visceral, something that twisted inside them, running through their veins like poison. The figure advanced, its movements slow, almost like a shadow dragged by the wind. But undeniably, it was getting closer. And as it moved, the air around them grew colder, denser, as if the very space was being compressed by the presence of this creature. They knew that, no matter how much they tried to run, they couldn't escape it. They were ready to face the terror, but no amount of preparation would ever be enough for this. The darkness had at last found them. The air became icy, a coldness that seemed to penetrate to the bones, as if the very essence of the place had transformed into something freezing and relentless. Each breath came out dense and visible, as if the air were being pulled from their chests, heavier with every passing second. The environment, once oppressive and dense, now seemed paralyzed, as if time itself had slowed down, trying to trap the intruders in that freezing, dark atmosphere. And then, with a snap in the silence, the clock, which had previously remained frozen in time, began to function again. The sound of its ticking, which had been absent, now emerged with a disturbing regularity, reverberating through the weathered walls of the barn. With each tick, the sound seemed deeper, more resonant, as if the mechanism itself were a monster of metal and gears, ready to consume the last remnants of hope. It was no longer a simple movement of hands. It was as though the sound were marking something far graver, something irreversible. The ticking seemed to echo almost ritually, filling every space with an oppressive presence. With each tick, the fear intensified. The sound was no longer just that of an old clock, but of something more, something ancient. It was as if time, once still, was now moving with a malevolent purpose, as if it were the sentence of an inevitable fate. It was as though the clock were marking the end, the conclusion of something beyond the understanding of the young one's present. Time was moving again, but with it came a sense that there was no way out. It was as if, by making the hands move once more, the house, the farm, the very universe was telling them that it was too late. The sound continued, each tick more imposing, more threatening, as if the very place were closing in on them. There was no denying it. The time they had lost, the curiosity that had brought them there, now seemed to be the razor's edge upon which they were balanced. The house, the clock, the sound, everything was conspiring to envelop them in its plot, and fate inevitably was being sealed. There was no turning back. The condemnation, silent and certain, was being marked with every passing second. The shadows in the house began to stir, as if they were no longer just an absence of light, but something far more sinister. They became more solid, denser, as if they were gaining form and substance of their own. They moved subtly, flowing along the walls and the floor, as if they were breathing, as if the darkness itself were alive and aware of its presence. With each movement of the shadows, the air seemed to grow heavier, more charged, as if something inside the house was awakening, feeding off the rising tension. And then, it became clear, something was alive there, something that fed off fear. The house was not just a stage for strange happening. It itself was an entity, a being that thrived on human emotions, nourished by uncertainties and the worst of fears. Fear now was palpable. It coiled around the young ones' hearts like a serpent, tightening its grip, making their breaths shallow and rapid, their eyes wide, their bodies tense and still. It was a growing, immense, and uncontrollable panic that enveloped them entirely, leaving no room for any emotion but pure, absolute terror. The house was alive and knew exactly what it was doing. The shadows, once mere parts of the scenery, now stretched and twisted as if they wanted to touch them, to envelop them. They moved slowly, almost with malicious intent, like invisible fingers trying to touch them, ensnaring them in their darkness. Every corner of the house seemed to breathe with its own pulse, an irregular beat echoing within their chests. It was as if the house itself had become a prison, and the shadows were the invisible chains that kept them there, unable to escape. Panic spread, but there was nowhere to run. The doors were shut, and the wind outside, which had once only whispered, now seemed to scream in an incomprehensible language. There was no safety anywhere. They were cornered, not just by physical darkness, but by a much older, more dangerous presence. With every step they took, the fear grew, sinking deeper into their souls, rendering them incapable of rational thought. Whatever was there, watching, waiting, was now feeding on every thought, every heartbeat, every breath. They were part of a game, and panic was the key that kept them trapped. The house, the shadows, the fear, everything was conspiring, and nothing seemed real. They were in a nightmare they couldn't control, living through something beyond human comprehension. A terror that was becoming physical, transforming the air into something thick and suffocating, as if it wanted to swallow everything and everyone. There was no escape left. They were facing something ancient and monstrous, something that had waited for their arrival, something that would not let them leave. They tried to run, but the house, as if it were a conscious entity, trapped them even more. The walls, once imposing and solid, now seemed to move, as if they had a life of their own, narrowing and curving in a terrifying manner. The hallways stretched, elongating as they ran, making them lose their way with every turn, with every step. Each door that opened led to a new labyrinth. Each window showed a distorted world, a dark reflection of reality. Time seemed to have lost its meaning, and their once swift and determined steps now turned desperate and erratic. The feeling of being followed was undeniable. It was as if the house itself was breathing behind them, its muffled whispers echoing off the walls, as if something was there, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was no longer just fear that dominated, but a presence, an invisible force moving alongside them, watching every movement, anticipating their next steps. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward them, like invisible hands trying to reach out, as if the very darkness itself was taking shape and preparing to pounce on them. The air was heavy, almost unbearable, making each breath harder to take. The sound of their hearts pounding in their chests blended with the echoes of their hurried steps, but soon dissolved into the emptiness of the house, which seemed to absorb swallowing any sound, any hope. The feeling of claustrophobia increased, the space closing in, growing tighter and tighter, as if the walls were pressing in around them. It was impossible to tell whether they were going forward or backward, whether they were closer to an exit or further into the darkness. Everything was distorted, as if the house had completely changed, become an endless prison, a nightmare with no way out. The sensation that something was watching them, silently, was overwhelming. They couldn't see it, but they could feel its presence, like a heavy shadow, drawing nearer and nearer with every passing second. It was too late to go back. They were inside a horror game, and the house would not let them. It didn't take long before, amid the confusion and desperation, one of the young people spotted a hidden staircase in a dark corner of the hallway. It appeared old, with steps worn by time, but still sturdy enough to support them. Not knowing what else to do, they gathered together and began to climb, the sound of their steps echoing through the oppressive silence that filled the house. With every step, the air grew heavier, more suffocating, until they finally reached the attic. The attic was immersed in a thick layer of dust, as if time had stopped there. Stacked boxes, furniture covered in torn sheets, and forgotten objects were scattered throughout the space, creating a sense of absolute abandonment. The light of the lantern flickered, casting shadows of the piled-up things, forming ghostly shapes on the walls and floor. The place seemed to stretch endlessly, a vast space of desolation and mystery. It was then, amidst all that chaos, that their eyes fixed on something peculiar. An old framed photograph rested on a table covered in dust. They approached hesitantly, as if some dark power were emanating from that simple image. The photo depicted a family smiling, a seemingly happy scene from days gone by. But something was wrong. The faces were frozen in expressions of forced happiness, almost too perfect to be real. But the worst part was the eyes. The eyes of the family were empty. There was no life in them, only a deep and absolute void, as if they were staring at something beyond the camera, beyond reality. They were not human eyes, but something else. A cold, soulless gaze, as if they had been torn from their own expressions, leaving only lifeless shells. It was as if the photo was witnessing something far darker than the simple portrait of a happy family. The air grew even colder. They felt as if the eyes of those people were following them, an invisible presence watching them from the other side of the photo, as if the very spirits of the family were trapped there, waiting, anticipating something. The sensation of being watched intensified. It wasn't just the shadows in the house that surrounded them. It was as if those empty eyes were somehow connected to the very essence of the farm, as if they were a window to something much more sinister, something that fed on those lost souls. The photo now was no longer just a relic of the past. It was alive in some way, full of macabre secrets, and these young people were about to discover that the farm was not just haunted, it was possessed, and the souls of those who had once lived there were trapped, waiting to be freed, or perhaps to free something even more terrifying. Around the photo, something strange caught their attention. Symbols were meticulously drawn along the frame, as if engraved into the wood, but the most disturbing part was what appeared to be dried blood. The dark liquid, now hardened, formed intricate, distorted patterns that intertwined in an incomprehensible. It was as if these symbols had been left there a long time ago, an indelible, a sort of seal, an invocation of something very ancient. One of the young people, unable to resist their curiosity, reached out and touched the image, their trembling fingers brushing the cold surface of the photo. The instant contact was made, the environment around them seemed to transform. The wind, which had been still until then, suddenly howled, like a distant wail, and the lantern in one of their hands flickered furiously, before going out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. The darkness was not just the absence of light, but an oppressive presence, dense and cold, enveloping like a heavy cloak. The silence was broken only by the distant ticking of the clock, which now seemed to speed up. The sound, once regular and deep, now beat frantically, with increasing intensity, as if time itself were losing control. Each tick sounded like a blow to the air, each beat a threat, as if the clock were trying to fulfill a sentence, hurried, anxious, as if time were about to run out. The wind continued to blow harder, shaking the shadows on the walls, making the cobwebs on the beams of the attic move as if they were alive. The air, now charged with a biting cold, seemed to wrap around their bodies, slowing their movement, making them more difficult. They could hardly breathe, and panic was taking over each of them, but something urged them to stay, to face what surrounded them. The feeling of being watched grew with each tick of the clock, as if the very walls of the house were alert, waiting for the exact moment to reveal its darkest secret. The ticking sound became almost unbearable, as if the clock itself were about to explode into a sea of shadows and pain, trapping them in a web of terror that seemed endless. In that absolute darkness, the only thing left was the certainty that, by touching the photo, they had awakened something that had been waiting a long time to be released. And now, there was no turning back. The clock, the house, the shadows. Everything was conspiring, and whatever was lurking had finally found them. It was then that the oldest of the group, his nerves on edge and his eyes wide, began to scream desperately, breaking the dark silence that surrounded them. His voice, fragile and trembling, echoed through the attic walls, but it seemed to be swallowed by the darkness that encased them. He could no longer distinguish what was real from what was merely an illusion created by panic. The line between the physical world and the supernatural was dissolving before him. Fear was taking over his mind, distorting reality. He no longer knew whether the threat was coming from inside or outside the house, if the shadows that were pursuing them were truly there, or if they were just manifestations of his collapsing mind. The young man's gaze became fixated, lost, on the photo with the family's empty eyes. He saw them, but he didn't really see them. The image seemed to warp. The eyes of those smiling figures now appeared to blink, as if they were alive, as if the souls of those people were trapped there, watching them, waiting, condemning them. Or perhaps it was even worse. Maybe the eyes were dead, empty, but somehow they could still see, and they were feeding on their fear, feeding on their confusion. He no longer knew what was real, but one thing was certain. The terror consuming their hearts was so great, they could hardly breathe. The pressure was unbearable. The air seemed to have turned into a dense, viscous substance, making even the simplest act of inhalation difficult. Each breath was a struggle, each heartbeat a sentence of dread. The sound of the ticking clock, once just a marking of time, now became a hammer of condemnation, beating furiously, faster with each passing second. Fear was swallowing them, crushing them, making their legs shake and their minds lose themselves in a whirlwind of disconnected thoughts. They felt as though they were being watched, as if the house itself were watching them, like a living entity about to devour them. The oldest continued to scream, his eyes turning to the others, searching for an answer, an explanation that would never come. He was completely lost, trapped in his own terrified mind, unable to escape this nightmare. The terror was now collective, a force that surrounded them, an invisible but tangible pressure that prevented them from thinking clearly. At that moment, they knew that something far beyond their deepest fears was happening. They were not just trapped inside the house. They were trapped in time itself, in the very essence of the evil that inhabited that place. And deep within their souls, they knew that what awaited them there, in the darkness, would be worse than anything they could imagine. The terror dragged on for minutes, or perhaps hours, an endless eternity where time seemed to distort. Every second was a silent scream, an unbearable pressure crushing them from within. The darkness, which once seemed like just an absence of light, was now alive, pulsating, with a malevolent energy surrounding them. The heavy, wavering steps echoed through the walls, but they didn't seem to advance, as if the house were expanding around them, swallowing every attempt to escape. Then, finally, one of them found the back door, a door that, until then, had seemed like just a shadow, an insignificant detail. But at that moment, it was the only hope. With trembling hands and a heart beating in the frantic rhythm of panic, he opened it, and a gust of cold air hit them. Freedom was there, or at least it seemed to be. The field stretched out before them, vast and open, a familiar yet unrecognizable landscape. What once seemed like a refuge now confused them. As they crossed through the door, a momentary sense of relief washed over them. The wind, which had been trapped within the walls of the house, now moved freely, caressing their faces. The night seemed calmer, less oppressive, but that feeling quickly faded, replaced by a strange, unsettling sensation. The field before them, which should have been an escape, seemed to stretch endlessly, more and more distant, like an endless nightmare. The horizon, which had once seemed clear, now distorted, making them feel as if they were walking without getting anywhere. There were no trees, no houses, no landmarks to indicate a path. They ran, but the ground seemed to expand, stretching out as they advanced. Each step took them further from any reference point, deeper into a landscape that made no sense. The field opened up endlessly, as if the very terrain were creating a labyrinth with no way out. The farm, now a dark stain in the distance, seemed to pull them back, as if an invisible force were drawing them into its limits. No matter where they ran, no matter how many steps they took, something was holding them, like an invisible prison keeping them trapped between the house and the field, between freedom and terror. It was as if the farm had become an extension of themselves, something that watched them, that controlled their movements, that fed off their failed attempts to escape. Fear turned into desperation as the field stretched on, endless, with no exit, and deep down, a terrifying truth began to form. They were trapped in a cycle, an illusion they couldn't comprehend, a nightmare that imprisoned them, where escape was impossible, and time would never be the same again. The farm was not just a physical place, it was impregnated with a curse, something deeper and unchangeable than the simple bricks and wood of the building. The walls, the fields, and the barns were not merely structures. They were part of something much older, something that transcended space and time. With each step they took, the weight of the curse seemed to intensify, as if the very roots of the earth were connected to the fate of each one of them, trapping them with no way out. The curse that permeated that place was not recent, nor something that could be easily undone. It was ancestral, laden with centuries of suffering and pain. The energy emanating from the house was not merely one of abandonment or decay, but a living force, something that fed on their fears and insecurities, something that watched them, waiting, always. Each window, each door, seemed to be watching them, observing them with a macabre patience. And the more they tried to escape, the more the farm enveloped them, like an invisible web tightening around their bodies and souls. There was no more room for refuge, nor for hope. The farm, with its elongated shadows and decaying walls, was a prison with no end, a labyrinth of terrors that fed on their own insecurities, their deepest anxieties. They were like puppets, trapped in a desperate dance, but with every movement they found themselves more and more entangled. The doors wouldn't open, the paths led nowhere. The feeling of being watched, of something waiting for them, never left. They were trapped inside something they couldn't comprehend, in an eternal cycle with no beginning, and the curse continued to feed on their souls. They could feel it, a presence that slowly drained them, as if they were being stripped of their essence with every breath, with every failed attempt to escape. Fear was no longer a fleeting, but something tangible, a being of its own that consumed them the inside out. The farm would not let them go. It had chosen them, and now they were part of it, as if their souls were intertwined with. And as time passed, the notion of escape became more and more unsustainable. They were trapped in a prison with no doors, in a place that fed on their emotions, their deepest fears, everything they were and everything they could have been. The farm, with its heavy air and imposing shadow, was not just a physical but a living entity, one that had consumed them and now waited patiently until nothing remained of their bodies, only their souls, wandering eternally in that endless prison. As time passed, the atmosphere on the farm grew increasingly oppressive. The shadows, once mere dark and diffuse figures, began to become more aggressive, as if they were taking on a life of their own. They moved with a terrifying speed, distorted and hungry, almost as if they were trying to swallow everything around them. The light from the lantern, already weak and flickering, barely managed to fend off the darkness that slithered across the walls, winding, seeping through the corners and cracks of the house. Every movement of those shadows felt like an imminent threat, an invisible yet palpable force determined to consume everything. The group felt the weight of the darkness consuming them. The pressure was immense, as if an invisible hand was squeezing their chests, making it harder to breathe. With every passing second, the fear deepened, becoming more entrenched, more penetrating. They could no longer distinguish what was real and what was a product of their terrified minds. The space around them seemed to distort, the walls of the house no longer serving as boundaries but as prisons, trapping them within that endless nightmare. Fear made them irrational. The young people's eyes widened in panic, but none of them could speak. Terror manifested in increasingly intense ways, causing reason to slip through their fingers. Each one, in some way, began to drift away from humanity, as if the house itself, with its curse, was stripping them of their emotions and consciousness. They were losing control of themselves, being consumed by the hopelessness the farm fed. They looked at each other, but no longer recognized the other. Fear had transformed into something greater, something that spread within each of them, distorting their perception of reality. The shadows were no longer just a reflection of external darkness. They were a reflection of what each of them was becoming, a deep emptiness, a black hole where there was no room for rational thought, only absolute terror. The group tried to move, but the ground seemed to turn into a viscous substance, trapping their feet and draining their strength. The shadows around them grew closer and closer until they completely enveloped them, transforming the house into a prison with no walls, no exits. Fear, darkness, and the curse had transformed them. And as the shadows became more aggressive, they were no longer who they had been when they first entered. They were now part of the darkness itself, so far removed from the light, reason, and the humanity that remained. There was only an empty and terrified essence, consumed by the farm itself. There was no turning back. The escape, which had once seemed a distant possibility, was now just an illusion, a lie that fear had constructed in their minds. The farm, with its walls that closed in as if they knew every movement, had swallowed them completely. They were no longer just their bodies trapped there. Their souls were also captive, intertwined with the curse of the place. Every shadow, every dark corner, every sigh of the wind carried the weight of a terror that would never leave them. The nightmare they had lived within those walls was no longer something distant or temporary. The terror that had paralyzed them, the feeling of being watched, the invisible presence that consumed them, had now become part of their very essence. Each of them felt this transformation, as if a part of their humanity had been ripped away and replaced with the darkness of the farm. They were no longer the same. What had begun as a simple game of curiosity, a search for something beyond, had now become an eternal prison, a mental and spiritual cage from which there was no escape. Fear accompanied them constantly, like a living shadow that never left. Their eyes, once full of life, now carried a deep emptiness, reflecting the same darkness that had consumed them. And even when they tried to distance themselves from the farm, even when the memory of that place seemed to fade with time, the mark of that experience followed them, like a ghost, always present. The terror had now become a scar on their souls, an indelible mark, impossible to erase, reminding them of what they had endured. And the scariest thing was knowing that somehow the farm still possessed them. Every step they took, every breath they drew, was like a reminder that, although they were physically far away, the place would never let them go. They were condemned to carry the weight of what they had faced, to feel the touch of darkness even in the brightest hours. They were the children of the farm, marked by the curse the land knew, and the terror they had felt there. In every corridor, in every sigh of the wind, now became part of their souls forever. The farm with its endless shadows had imprisoned them, and there was no going back. Over the years, the farm remained there, inert and silent, like an open wound, and time seemed to have stagnated around it, as if nature itself avoided touching it. The wind continued to whisper through the dry trees and abandoned field, bringing with it the echoes of something ancient and irreparable. The shadows, which seemed to have a life of their own, continued to stretch with the fall of night, reaching in impossible directions, as if they wanted to swallow everything in their path. There were no longer sounds of laughter or footsteps, only the sound of the wind, eerily moving through the ruins of what had once been a house full of life. The farm was no longer a home, it was a presence, an invisible monster that fed on the memory of what it had been and the pain it had left behind. The land seemed to be impregnated with evil, and the trees, with their twisted trunks, seemed to be watching the region, like sentinels of a cursed place. People avoided the area, knowing that the terror that had settled there was not something that could be forgotten or simply ignored. The few brave souls who dared approach, perhaps driven by curiosity or courage, felt a chill run down their spine. It wasn't ordinary fear, but something deeper, something that touched the soul and made the heart race, as if the farm itself knew every step, every thought, and was watching them with invisible eyes. Reports about the place turned into legends, stories whispered in the dark, and soon the farm was forgotten, except by those who still felt the weight of what they had witnessed. But the terror never left them. It was ingrained in the stones of the crumbling house, in the shadows that never dissipated, in the wind that whispered incomprehensible words. The evil had taken root so deeply that no one could escape its presence. The farm remained, motionless, waiting. It knew that as long as it was remembered, its power would never fade. Some said that the souls of the young still haunted the field, trapped between the shadows, trying to find a way out of the nightmare that had imprisoned them. Their spirits, wandering aimlessly, were seen by those who approached at night, floating between the dry branches of the trees, or walking slowly across the fields, like distorted shadows, more a part of the curse than human beings. Their ethereal figures, with pale faces and empty eyes, seemed to search for something, as if they were still on an unfulfilled mission, something that bound them to that cursed land. But what were they searching for? Freedom? Peace? Or were they simply condemned to exist in that limbo, reliving their last hours for all eternity? Others believed that the farm was waiting for its next victim, luring those who, driven by curiosity or stubbornness, were bold enough to challenge its dark secrets. They spoke of an invisible force that called people into the house, and once inside, swallowed them, trapping them in its curse. It was as if the land itself, thirsty for souls, fed on the fear and hopelessness of those who entered its domain. Every new visitor, drawn by the mystery or the promise of unraveling, became a part of the farm's history, another piece in the macabre puzzle that would never be solved. And so, the farm remained, still and silent, with its threatening presence hovering. The shadows continued to stretch with the arrival of night, and the wind still whispered, as if inviting the unwary to approach. Time on the farm seemed to have stopped, as if the place were suspended between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And as the cycle repeated, the mystery of the farm grew ever darker and more seductive, attracting those who dared to cross its boundaries, unaware that by doing so, they became a part of the curse that never ended. And so, the farm remained, forgotten by the living, but never by the evil that resided there. Its mystery was buried deep within the earth, where silence and darkness intertwined, guarding secrets as old as the place itself. It was as if the land itself were complicit in the curse, keeping it alive, preserved, ready to awaken at any moment. The wind, still whispering through the twisted trees, was the only witness that time, there, held no real meaning. It continued to circulate, spreading echoes of past screams, of lost souls, who, like all the others, had fallen into the trap of that place. The farm was not merely waiting to be discovered, it was waiting for more souls. Souls that would get lost in its endless terrors, walking the same corridors where others had succumbed before. Like an entity that feeds on pain, doubt, and fear, it waited patiently, like a predator awaiting the right moment to strike. Its empty fields, its crumbling barns, and its walls covered in moss and spiderwebs were just the backdrop. The true evil lay in the depths, in something that could not be seen, but could be felt in every labored breath, in every shadow that stretched beyond the natural. No bolder gaze could escape the farm's force. Those who ventured near felt an invisible pull, as if something inside the house wanted to draw them in, a silent invitation, but one impossible to resist. Fear was not just a feeling, It was the essence of everything that existed there. Every story told about the farm was like a layer of salt to prevent the curse from spreading. But it remained, unchanging, waiting, just waiting, to swallow more souls who, unknowingly, would lose themselves in the endless horrors of that place, becoming yet another part of its dark, eternal history.
Thank you for watching the video. If you were impressed by the mystery and terror of this farm, share it with your friends and challenge them to uncover the secrets too. The more people who know this story, the more intense the experience becomes. Don't miss the next video that will appear on the screen, filled with more mysteries and surprises. See you then. Get ready for a dark and chilling journey. In this video, we tell a terrifying horror story set on a farm, where mysteries, shadows, and the supernatural come together in a desolate, abandoned setting. On an isolated farm, far from any help, something much more frightening than simple legends haunts the house. Something that is waiting for its next victim. With the wind howling, doors creaking, and secrets buried deep, this farm holds horrors that defy reason. Will this horror story make you look at empty fields in a different way? With every minute, the mystery and fear grow, and you won't want to miss a single detail of this.